The year was 1917, almost 3 years into the Great War, the war to end all wars. And for the first time, the 4 Canadian divisions fought as one in their mission to take Vimy Ridge in northern France from the occupying Germans. Close to 3,600 Canadian soldiers were killed, 7,000 more were wounded. But that 4-day fight, which ended 100 years ago tonight, resulted in a victory that's come to mean so much more than the few kilometers known as Vimy Ridge. Why? Let's take that up. In Calgary, Alberta, here's Holger Herwig. He's Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Calgary, specializing in German history. And with us here in studio, Major Michael Boire, military historian at the Royal Military College of Canada and leader of the school's Battlefield Trip program. Margaret Macmillan, Professor of International History, Oxford University, and the author of The War That Ended Peace. Tim Cook, military historian at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa and the author of Vimy, The Battle and the Legend. And Ian Mackay, the Wilson Chair of Canadian History at McMaster University and co-author of The Vimy Trap, or How We Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Great War. That's a good subtitle. Thank you, everybody, here in studio for being with us tonight on this very important date in Canadian history. And to Holger Herwig in Calgary, we're happy to have you aboard as well. Let's get the map up, because I don't want to assume everybody knows where Vimy Ridge is. There it is in northern France, right close to the border with Belgium. And 100 years ago today, the guns fell silent following a 4-day battle, the bloodiest, as we've suggested, in Canadian history. But the Canadian Corps did take that 7-kilometer-long ridge from the Germans who had previously held it. And how's this for a picture? This is Tim, is this from your book? I think it is.
Yes, it is.
Look at 2 Canadians surveying their accomplishments on the day. Tim, let's just, we don't want to spend a lot of time, I think, on the battle, because over the last few days, that story has been told many times. But again, for those who may not know, the French tried to take it back and failed. The British tried to take it back and failed. The Canadian Corps was successful. Right. How come?
Well, the Canadians had come off the Somme, the bloody Somme, where they'd lost about 24,000 casualties from September to November 1916. And they knew they had to learn to fight more effectively. And this was happening across the British Army and the German Army as well, fighting more effectively on defense. They instigated new infantry tactics, artillery tactics, combining the two, better use of intelligence, a decentralization of command. And they really prepared hard for this battle that they knew was going to come. Of course, as you said, the Germans had captured the position on October 1914. They had held it against a series of counterattacks from the Allies. When the Canadians arrived on the battlefield, in fact, it's an open graveyard of unburied corpses. So I wonder what that would have been like for those Canadians to stare up at that hulking mass towering above them and realize that's the position that they had to attack.
Here's what awaited them, and then Major Boire, I'm going to get you to react to this. Wounded men were sprawled everywhere in the slime, in the shell holes, in the mine craters, some screaming to the skies, some lying silently, some begging for help, some struggling to keep from drowning in water-filled craters, the field swarming with stretcher bearers trying to keep up with the casualties. That's an account from the official record of the 2nd Division's 6th Brigade, made up mostly of Western Canadians. Follow up on that, if you would. What was it like for the poor, average Canadian?
Can we start at the beginning of the battle for these young men? And a great deal of them, many of them had just arrived in the Canadian Corps, because as Tim points out, after the Somme, much had to be done to learn, but also much had to be done to introduce reinforcements, young soldiers, into the Canadian Corps. So when the Corps does finally attack, a great percentage of them are relatively new. So this is their first battle. If you can take the life of a soldier back then, it was relatively comfortable out of the line. They ate well. They didn't eat often, but they ate well. They were warm. They were clothed. And they spent the majority of their time outside the trench system. So when it came time to attack Vimy Ridge, what happens is, of course, that they begin the march forward. And these young men are in their platoons and companies and battalions, marching towards the ridge. When they get to the ridge, they have to go underground into a series of caverns and tunnels, which gets them protected into the front line. And there they're waiting inside the tunnels. Some are waiting in craters and trenches. And they're waiting for 0 hour at 5:30 on the 9th of April.
5:30 a.m., April 9th, it all began.
It all began. Now,
on a snowy, miserable, cold day.
Luckily, well, it was snowy at the top of the ridge, and it was raining and slushy at the bottom. But luckily, that caused a lot of Germans to misfire their machine guns, and that saved a lot of young lives.
The fighting was like what?
Well, up they get. They're following the barrage. It was a tricky, tricky deal following the barrage because it was composed at first of shrapnel rounds. Now, shrapnel rounds were rounds that exploded over the soldiers' heads and fired BBs into the ground, big balls into the ground in front of them. And the point of that was to keep Germans in their dugouts as we advanced towards them. And of course, as they're advancing and crossing this shell-blasted landscape, they're losing dressing, they're losing the alignment. Some are getting lost, some are disoriented, but many of them get to the first, second, and third German fortifications, and they're waiting. If they followed the barrage properly, they're waiting for the Germans to come out of the dugouts to capture them or kill them. And this goes on for the entire day. It's from one trench system to another, following closely to the barrage, which took an enormous amount of practice to get used to. And a lot of times the barrage fell behind or fell in front and caused casualties amongst their own boys. As they're getting into German fortifications, the Germans are coming out of their holes. The German units that held the ridge were demons. They fought very hard and very well, as did our young men. And the intensity of the combat caused the description of events that you've just shown. But it was very much, more than we think when we really look at the contemporary documents. There was a lot of bayonet work, a lot of fighting, a lot of hand-to-hand combat, and both sides caused a great deal of damage. It has to be remembered, and I don't mean to be grisly with this, is that when the Germans did cause nearly 4,000 fatal casualties. It's an indication of just how hard fought that battle was.
Having said that, Margaret Macmillan, there is the battle, there is the myth-making that went associated with it, which we shall discuss. There is also Vimy role as a military campaign in terms of the end of the war, and how important it was or wasn't towards the eventual victory. Talk about that.
Well, the war didn't end for well over a year after Vimy Ridge was taken, and so I think it was a tactical success. It was an important position to take because it dominated the plains, and whoever held it had a tremendous advantage. But I think Vimy itself didn't hasten the end of the war. What it did, I think, very importantly, was give the Allies some hope that they were actually now capable of attacking and taking positions. And so it was a demonstration that finally the generals, in this case, I think General Byng, commanding that sector, and also, of course, General Currie, the Canadian general, were learning how to deal with a strongly entrenched defense and learning how to use new tactics and new weapons. But 1917 was a pretty bad year for the Allies. Russia was about to drop out of the war and did drop out really by the summer of 1917.
They had their own little revolution to deal with.
They had all that to deal with, which meant the Germans could then begin to transfer troops to the Western Front. And the United States, yes, came in just after, of course, just before Vimy started. But the United States wasn't going to be able to get troops to Europe until the following spring. And so from the Allied point of view, 1917 was not a great year. And so Vimy, I think, is important because it gave a little bit of confidence that maybe things would eventually change.
There was a name in there that you mentioned I want to pick up on, and I'll go to you on this. British General Julian Byng. People may know his name from the famous political King Byng affair. He's the future Governor General who was in the midst of all that. They may remember his wife, whose name is on a rather important trophy in the National Hockey League, the Lady Byng, for the most gentlemanly conduct. But this has gone down in history as myth-making because it was a Canadian thing. And Byng's role in our attempt to make myth, I want to ask you, has it been overshadowed? Has the British role been downplayed? Speak to that, if you would.
Yes, I think that's a great question. I think the British role has emphatically been downplayed. Recent research by Nick Clark in a site called Active History shows that 43.7% of the soldiers who took Vimy Ridge were officially not in Canadian units, but they were in British units. So that's suggestive, and many of the people in the Canadian units were very, very recent British immigrants. So in a sense, we've Canadianized it over the years, and the role of Byng is fundamentally essential to the battle. He was instrumental in the tactic and the strategy. And just to comment on what was achieved in the battle, it was almost a great disappointment because they didn't really advance much beyond Vimy Ridge. You'd expended, nearly 4,000 lives for a gain of, several thousand yards, but you hadn't actually shifted the Western Front in any significant way. And that great height of land that people hoped would command a territory really didn't make that much difference in the overall course of the war.
In the military strategic part of the war.
Yes.
In terms of myth-making, was a different story.
We disagree on this.
Yes.
I mean, I do think Vimy Ridge is an important tactical position. If the Canadians had not taken it, the Germans would have counterattacked through the ridge and rolled up the British offensive further to the south. It is a key position, there's no doubt about that. And Nick's research about the British forces is a useful corrective to remember the Canadian Corps is actually 170,000 at this point. But almost all of the infantry in the battle are Canadian. Almost all of the machine gunners at the front are Canadian. Almost all of those casualties fall to the Canadians who are doing the fighting. That's not to denigrate or push aside the British contribution, which is immense. 30,000 British gunners, thousands of British soldiers on the lines of logistics, the roads, the railways. But it is the Canadians really at the sharp end here. And it's not wrong to say that this is a Canadian battle.
Yeah. Let's go. You know what? We got to get Calgary into this because we haven't heard from Professor Hovig yet. So let's get Holger Hervig into this. You heard a moment ago, Professor, that Major Boire described the Germans who killed nearly 4,000 Canadians that day as demons. You're born in Germany. It is your area of expertise to understand the German army from this time. Let me hear from you who they were and how they fought.
Okay, it was basically a unit of Bavarian reservists commanded by a 73-year-old superannuated general named Falkenhausen, who believed that every inch of territory had to be held at all cost. He had not bought into the new elastic defense in depth, and he stood up on the ridge determined to hold every piece. He thought his army was absolutely ready for a defensive battle. His commanders argued no. The Bavarians had fought on the Somme, they had fought at Verdun, some had fought at both, and they were described as being debris, slag, worn out, burned out, and they were sent to Vimy for some R&R. It was a quiet sector, and they were sent down there to recover from this horrendous experience of the Somme and Verdun.
That's a long way, Major, from describing them as the demons that you just did.
Well, I'll stick with that. If you look at the small unit actions all along the ridge, the Bavarians, the Prussians on top at Hill 145, what you do see, though the battle took place rather rapidly, what you do see are in small unit actions. And in German records, you see an awful lot of very brave young men holding off an opponent that is bound to get them, that is coming at them from the base of the ridge, covered by artillery and ready for a fight. The German defensive position along the ridge, though it is in fortifications which are immensely powerful, the number of Germans along the ridge during this particular action are very weak because, of course, in the build-up to the battle, an awful lot of raiding has gone on, an awful lot of shell fire, and the German strength has been depleted. But those who are left with the few Germans, not few, but the German soldiers who are on the line on 145 and down to 135 and the other really large hills along the ridge, fight very well. They're of course hamstrung by a lack of artillery and by the shortcomings that Professor Hervig just pointed out.
Tim, I want to get you in on this because while there's certainly plenty of actual history to discuss, there's a great what-if question about history that you raise in your book, which is that there was a young guy, First World War soldier, at Vimy for a time named Adolf Hitler.
Right.
But he left the scene before the battle took place.
Yeah.
What if he'd stayed? What if he'd been killed there?
Yes.
How might history have been different?
Well, I think of all those soldiers who were there, who were killed, who might have contributed to history. I think of the young Canadians who were killed there, who might have come back and remade our country. And of course, on the German side, losing thousands of soldiers as well. And one of them, of course, could have been Adolf Hitler. His unit was there. They had moved north before the battle, but if his unit had been there, the course of history might have changed. And of course, those of us who study history, those of us who write about it, are always interested in those events, the what-ifs, to tell us something about it. I think in a larger sense, the what-if is what if the Canadians had failed at Vimy? I mean, that is quite likely. We're talking today about we're on the 12th of April. The Canadians attacked the Pimple, which was a major fortified position, fortified by Prussian soldiers to the north, who were very good soldiers, and we drove them off that. If the Germans had held that, they could have counterattacked through that position. They could have counterattacked through Hill 145, where the monument is today. So there, you know, nothing is, we look back on history and we think, well, this is how it was. Of course, as we know, there were a lot of things that could have happened during that battle that didn't, and I think it's worthwhile to reflect upon that. And certainly there was a tremendous amount of bravery and sacrifice, grit and endurance by the Canadians, by the Germans on that very bloody ridge.
If I may.
Let me, you know what, I got to get Margaret in here because I want to make sure, I'm going to share the time equally here. Margaret, for some reason, Vimy has, it's bigger than Juno right now. It's bigger than Korea. It's bigger than Afghanistan. It has almost superseded all other Canadian military events. I know we're on the 100th anniversary and that has something to do with it, but it doesn't have everything to do with it. What's going on?
I don't know. It is, I'm sorry, that's not a very good answer, but it is a mystery to me why the public imagination and interest, including myself, of course, will pick on a particular battle rather than another one. It's the same thing with the Australians with Gallipoli. The Australian troops fought all the way through the First World War. Why aren't they celebrating? They're celebrating a big defeat or commemorating a big defeat. Why aren't they remembering the taking of Damascus, for example, or the taking of Jerusalem? And it's, you know, so we've somehow fixed on Vimy. But I think these things fluctuate. I mean, I think it's partly that there has been a very determined effort by, for example, the Vimy Foundation to bring it to our attention. Certainly politically, it's been seen as an important occasion. I think also there's a physical spot. I mean, I think the physical place and the monument have helped to fix it into our imaginations. But it does come and go, this remembering. Because when I was young, I mean, a long time ago in the 50s at school in Ontario, we didn't learn about Vimy. It was not something that was a big deal. I mean, I didn't really remember hearing much about it when I was at university in the 60s. And so I do think these things, I think, are slightly unpredictable.
It was big, and then it receded from our sort of collective consciousness, and now it's back in a major way. I want to read this, if I can. And I'll get you to comment on this, because here's Brigadier General Alexander Ross, who commanded a battalion at Vimy, and this is in 1967, so it's the 50th anniversary, and he described the assault this way. He said, "It was Canada. From the Atlantic to the Pacific on parade, I thought then that in those few minutes I witnessed the birth of a nation." There's that myth-making thing again, that so many prime ministers, and if you go back to this past weekend's events, I mean, Justin Trudeau referred to it, David Johnston, the Governor General, referred to it. Did conquering that ridge make us a nation in a way we weren't before?
No.
Big point of disagreement, needless to say, but fire away. What do you say?
I think in the 1920s and 1930s, the people who had actually fought at Vimy and in the Great War had a completely different sense of the war and of Vimy. I think they thought of it as a Holocaust, a word they used repeatedly, and I think they would respond to today's glorification of Vimy and the war as putting a happy face on a Holocaust. I think they would be horrified and dumbfounded at this elevation of a relatively inconclusive battle, after which the Germans struck a medal to congratulate their soldiers for basically holding the Western Front. I think they would be horrified at the elevation of this battle into an instance of glorifying war itself. I think it's a moral and empirical error to do this.
Let me put this in the context I lived, and I have no great objections to your description of it, Professor. I was lucky enough to serve in the Black Watch in Montreal, a Montreal regiment that sent 12,000 young men to war, and over 2,000 didn't come back. However, amongst those who came back were very many great men, veterans, who stayed in touch with the regiment. And as a young man in the 1960s, doing my best to fit into that very spooky organization, I talked to them. I talked to many score of these young men who were, you know, this was the 60s. They were still in good health, and they still had memories. Taking the memories of battles out of them and trying to talk to them about the battles, that was the kind of reaction I received. They would talk about their leave. They would talk about the friends the friends they had made. And they talk about their memories, and these questions were precious to me because I was a young soldier trying to fit in. And I remember asking this to many of them. You know, what is the big battle? What is that big memory that you brought back from 4 years of that terrible war? There were three answers. It fell into one of the three. The first of the great memories was Passchendaele. the trauma of Passchendaele marked them all. Then it was the 100 Days, when the boys looking at me bragged, we started to break the German army. And the third was the gas attack in Saint-Julien. And when I mentioned Vimy, there was, yes, we were there. So in terms of significance in their memories, Vimy was one of the many battles they fought in. The importance that's given Vimy is certainly after the fact, and it starts, as you just pointed out, in 1967 with the CBC series on the 50th anniversary of Vimy, where these common memories shared by the men who fought the battle were brought onto onto radio, and it was the glorification. It was the moment of nationhood. I think these are constructions and a mythology, and I don't think they're particularly useful to a study of history.
Okay, Tim.
Right, I've been sitting here quietly.
But not happily.
No, not happily, not really. I mean, I've written a whole book on this, the evolution of the idea, and here I think Ian and Jamie and I disagree. We've looked at the evidence, we've looked at a lot of evidence, and I think we come to different conclusions. And mine is that Vimy, of course, is more than a battle. So when we talk about Vimy, we're not just talking about the battle itself. As Margaret has said, it is the monument and the battle. And the monument is to all of Canada's dead. And we saw that on the weekend. This was not a childish event that was unfolding on the 9th. This was a solemn event. The speeches were suitably grave, I think. They spoke to the sacrifice, they spoke to the loss, they spoke, again, to never again. And I think it would be wrong to characterize that all the veterans in the 20s and 30s were for peace. Many of them believed they had done the right thing. They believed in the justness of the war. There were certainly thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands who thought that they had wasted their lives and seen their comrades killed, but certainly not all. There's a very strong group who band together in the Legion and veterans groups who want to remember the war, the camaraderie of the war. And Vimy quite simply matters. It matters for a whole bunch of reasons. It is a symbol, though. And I think that's what we're talking about. Vimy has become more than a battle. It uses the monument as a backdrop in which we as Canadians have played out much of our history, much of our identity. And what I do in my book, and Ian does in his as well, is to look at the evolution of this idea over time. And it has indeed risen and fallen throughout time. There's no doubt about that. But I think the anchor in the idea has always been the monument and the desire of Canadians to return to this place. And it would be simply wrong to say that this is a made-up event, that this is a myth. I think it is a powerful story that motivates some Canadians, not all. There'd be many Canadians who say, this is not my story. And I would say, that's fine. We're a very big country, a complex country, a changing country. We have many symbols. But for many Canadians, Vimy matters.
Well, you say it's not everybody's story. I know one place in this country where it's not their story, and that's Quebec. No. You want to focus on that for a second?
Well, this is the trouble with public memory. I mean, you know, the history is one thing where we sift the evidence and we understand that many stories in history are complex. But what we do as publics is we flatten that out and we simplify it. And yes, I think Vimy is a symbol, and it's become a symbol. And I think there's been in some quarters, a very deliberate attempt to make it into a symbol of the birth of Canada as a nation. I mean, the Prime Minister repeated that. This was the moment at which Canada became a nation. But if I were living in French Canada, I would probably say, well, no, it wasn't necessarily for me. But I would also say, as an English-speaking Canadian, Canada does not have a symbol or a symbolic moment when it became a nation. We evolved peacefully over a long time, and there are many things that have gone into our history. So I think no one is saying that we shouldn't commemorate or be appreciative of those who died in Canada's wars. I don't think, Tim, anyone would say that. But I think what I would say is that I don't like to see the complex history of Canada flattened into a particular symbol. We were becoming a nation over a period of time. We were becoming a nation in the Great War, between 1914 and 1918, because we were becoming aware of our contributions to that war. And so Vimy was, yes, a part of it, but there's much, much more to the story. And we also evolved peacefully. I mean, I think sometimes we've felt that we don't have an American War of Independence, we don't have a French Revolution, we don't have a Russian Revolution, or whatever. We need something. I don't agree with that. I mean, I think we're grown up enough not to need that sort of history. And the idea that Canada was a nation created on the battlefield seems to me absolutely absurd. We were created in many ways. Battlefield's a part of it, but I don't want to see the battlefield becoming the major part of our story.
Let me go to Calgary, because I do want to, I think our viewers have got a sense of the debate here in the studio about, you know, how much this was in fact the birth of a new nation or not, that the debate will continue. I'm interested in how Germany reported on and felt about this in the decades after the battle took place. What about that?
Vimy does not play a role in any of the German historiography. Erich Ludendorff simply noted that that day, April 9th, was his birthday, and it kind of spoiled it. Field Marshal Hindenburg simply commented, well, it was a bad day. The German official history barely mentions it. The Canadians are not mentioned. It's simply British troops, Tommies who we fought. The German newspapers did not mention Vimy. They simply said that other than attacking Field Marshal Haig's armies at Arras, there was also action somewhere else. And in the 1920s, Vimy and Canada simply is not part of that story.
Let me show a picture to everybody here. This is Sheldon in the middle of page 7 right now. This is the location of the monument during World War II. 1940, I think. And there's Adolf Hitler at the Vimy Memorial, which is obviously built to commemorate Canada's lost soldiers and military contribution. Tim, why didn't Hitler destroy that monument?
Well, as we talked about before, Hitler had served in the First World War. He had tremendous respect for the Great War veterans who had survived. Vimy was overrun as France was overrun in May of June of 1940, and Canadians actually woke up on the 2nd and 3rd of June 1940 with headlines in their paper saying Vimy Ridge Monument has been destroyed. And it was a really shocking event for Canadians. A few days later, they found out it hadn't been destroyed. And then a few days later, they saw that image reprinted in the papers. And Hitler had gone there to show that he hadn't blown it up, but also to inspect it. And I think the Germans and the Nazis did, in fact, blow up a number of monuments on the Western Front, but they were often ones that were French monuments that showed victory over Germany. And I think to maybe step back a bit, the power of Allward's monument is that it is a monument to mourning. It is a monument to loss. Those 20 sculptured figures, the 11,285 names of Canadians on there with no known graves in France. Maybe Canada bereft, the most powerful grieving figure, the mother who overlooks the empty tomb. And Hitler had no desire to blow it up, and it was damaged during the war, but survived afterwards. And I think it is because it is a very powerful monument to mourning and loss. And what's interesting about that, to come back to our other conversation, is how Vimy then gets incorporated back into our history as a place of triumph, as a place of victory. And I think the only way to think about it is that those two ideas sit together, of mourning and loss and never again, and of victory and unity of command in battle, those 4 divisions with Canadians from across the country. And all of that, I think, sits at Vimy Ridge and informs the idea of Vimy over time.
We haven't talked much about the monument here, and on purpose, because we have an item coming up immediately thereafter. Rachel McQuaig, who's a wonderful photographer, took some of the most spectacular images of the monument I've ever seen, and she was there on the weekend, and we'll show some of her pictures. And that's why we're not talking about Walter Allward very much, although you really get into him in a great way in your book. Back to Holger in Calgary. How do Germans' commemorations of World War I compare to the commemorations they do on World War II?
World War I commemorations in Germany you can still see in almost every village you go to. In the center of a square, there's usually some kind of a monument. The names of the boys from that village who died there are chiseled in stone. People remember it. Beside it, you will simply see a plaque to those from this village who died in World War II. It's not personal. It was so massive. No one has come to grips with that. But World War I is still seen as a defense of Bavaria, Württemberg, Saxony, Prussia, etc. And it is recognized and it is celebrated.
Ian, let me get you in on this one. Over the past century, Canadian governments of various stripes, of all stripes in fact, have connected Vimy to peacekeeping operations, the war in Afghanistan, other military operations that we do. Vimy keeps coming up. How come?
I think they are channeling some of Walter Allward's motivation when he designed the monument, which is, in Allward's words, a sermon in stone against war. He doesn't actually see it as a Canadian war memorial. He sees it as a sermon against war. And I think that was the overwhelming tone of the 1936 unveiling of the Vimy Monument. So I think this association of striving for a more peaceful world is deeply intertwined in Canadian thinking, and it really goes back to the 1920s and 1930s when they were wrestling with this Holocaust. They were saying surely there must have been some meaning, some importance to this war, and they said many soldiers would write and say the only meaning I can find is if we never have another war. And I think that lies very deeply embedded in the Canadian consciousness. Think of the overwhelming success of Mackenzie King as a Canadian Prime Minister. And what Mackenzie King was about, among many things, and very confusing, perplexing figure, but if you look at his writings, you'll see at the very core of Mackenzie King's political thought is peace. That is his core virtue. And I think that speaks to an underlying interwar sentiment among, I would say, the vast majority of Canadians.
Well, not to get too far off the path here,
Right.
but I did read in Tim Cook's book that, the longest-serving Prime Minister in Canadian history, Prime Minister King, didn't show up for the unveiling of Ulred's memorial. He didn't serve in battle, so he was a little worried about what kind of reception he might get.
Right.
That's part of the story, isn't it?
That's part of the story. And of course, veterans were outraged at how he treated Lord Byng when he was Governor General, and as you mentioned before, the constitutional issues of 1926. So I think you're right about Mackenzie King, who's our fascinating Canadian, our longest-serving Prime Minister, who had seen the First World War and the legacy of it destroy the country and his party, or come close to destroying the country. The fractures along regional, linguistic, and class lines were very bitter. And I think, as I say in my book, and as I said during the events on the 9th when I was on CBC talking about that, we have to talk about that. The First World War as an event which really changes us as a country, where we step forward at Versailles and other events, where we see ourselves in a different way. But we also have to acknowledge that the First World War was terribly damaging to unity in our country. And some of those scars we still see today. And I think together they have to be talked about. And I think, again, that's why Vimy is more than just a battle. It is the monument, it is the idea.
I think the struggle between the war shirker King and the war hero Byng in 1926 ends up with
We opted for King.
But that's far too simplistic.
Canadians,
far too simplistic.
I don't think so.
I think it is.
I think Canadians were presented with a fairly stark choice to reject this person who didn't serve in the war. The Conservatives brought that up endlessly. It hurt Mackenzie King's feelings very deeply, because he actually felt he had served by keeping industrial relations going through the First World War. And King prevailed. I would have thought in the militarist Canada that people are describing to us in the 20s and 30s, when everybody is falling in love with Vimy, I would have thought King would have been sent packing. Not the case. And running an election very much against Arthur Meehan and Lord Byng, King prevails.
Meehan, the Conservative leader.
Yes, it's
I
think that's a profoundly telling indication of where the Canadian mainstream was in the 20s and 30s. Granted, not a simple mainstream, very complicated. Yeah. But if you're looking at actually who is going to win political power on this crucial issue of the war, it was not the people who were saying Mackenzie King was a shirker.
Okay. It's not about the war, but the key event for Vimy is not in the 1920s, and that's what I say in my book. It's quite interesting that you don't find Vimy as a very prominent symbol among Canadians. It's 1936, it's the pilgrimage, it's the return. And I think that idea of Canadians returning to this ridge, to this monument, has been a very powerful one. And we've come back in 1967, in 1992, 2007, and then 25,000 Canadians a couple days ago. There's something there.
I want to pick up on that, because let's explore the two ends of the continuum here. This past weekend, I had the honor of being there for the first time in my life. How many times have you been there?
Oh, I lived there. I lived in France for 4 years, and
so you have seen that monument how many times?
Oh God, well over 100. I spent weekends on the battlefield. I wanted to know what happened there, and I wanted to know what happened to Canada in the First and Second World War.
Why does it hold such an important place, obviously, in your soul?
Like the other battlefields do. Vimy is still accessible. Much of Hill 145 is you can still visit. The memorial itself, as Tim points out, makes a tremendous statement, which you have to think about whenever you wander around the battlefields. But as a soldier and wandering around and trying to learn lessons from what I saw, I was always struck with just how large a role luck played, simple blind luck, bravery on both sides, and how a near-run thing it was. It really was a near-run battle, though it is often described as a walkover. We prepared for 6 months, we learned from the Somme, and my God, we just showered across the ridge.
But I'm going,
it's not true.
I'm sorry, Major, I'm going to get all mushy with you here.
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't think you go back to the same site 150 times just because of your interest in military strategy. This monument clearly speaks to you in some way.
Yes, it does, but it speaks to my students as well. I bring 30 students over every year to look at the memorial and to look at the other memorials in other Canadian battlefields as well. And remember why the memorial is there, just to be bloody-minded about it. The memorial is there because more people can see it there than any other place in the battlefield. It's very clear at the end of the First World War that the Canadian National War Memorial has to go to either Hill 62 or Passchendaele or Saint Julien in the Ypres salient. That's just an aside. It ends up going in the right place, I think. But it has an effect, as Tim pointed out, it has an effect. You have to look at the 20 statues on that and try to figure out what Allward's going to say. You know, because sometimes if the light's right, it appears very clear. And if the light's not right, the messages of the statues are interpretable.
That's quite true.
And when you bring 30 young, I bring every year 30 young students from the Royal Military College. All of them are going to be future officers, and they think they know what they're getting into. Right? They're only in their first years of their careers. They think they know what being an officer is, what being a combat soldier is. They think they know it because of the studies they've taken. Well, that's all very nice, but once they look at the statues, once they look at the memorial, once they look at the battlefield, and I take them all through it to show what happened, and with other battlefields as well in Canada's great history, all of them come to me afterwards and say, I didn't know it was like this. This is a game changer, and that's why I think the battlefield tours that are becoming more frequent with Canadian students are an excellent idea. It's good to see what happened. It's also good to see the result of not avoiding war.
Right. Margaret MacMillan, let me talk about 2017 with you for a second. This is kind of a big year for anniversaries. We've got the 150th anniversary of the creation of our country. We have on Monday the 35th anniversary of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which has been such an essential part of the civil and human rights of people who live in this country. And actually, it's today, 100 years ago today, in the province of Ontario, the first right to vote law was passed for women in the province by the Hearst government. So this is a year of significant anniversaries, including the 100th anniversary of Vimy. Where does it rank in your pantheon?
I wouldn't rank them. I mean, I just think anniversaries are important. Although they have to be approached with, I think, some certain amount of care. I mean, anniversaries are important because I think it's important for us to know our history. And it's a moment at which you stop, you reflect, you pause, you remind the next generations that these were major events in the past. But where I'm wary of anniversaries is if they become, this is the only thing you need to know. This is the only key event in your history. I mean, I think what we have to do is somehow get over to successive generations that you need to know your history because it's what's produced you and your society. But that history is always open to question. You know, what we do in history is ask questions about it. And I think what we're doing here, talking about the meaning of Vimy and sometimes disagreeing, is absolutely what we should be doing. What I don't like is sort of officially sponsored commemorations of the past which say, this is how you must commemorate it. You know, I think, you know, as Canadians, we have a very nice bloody-mindedness where we say, if we're told to commemorate something in a particular way, we'll say no. There are other ways of looking at it. And I think that's all right. I think that's what we have to make people understand.
We didn't kind of embrace the War of 1812 200th anniversary earlier in 2012.
No,
we did not.
No, and I think with reason, because I think the government at the time was trying to make that into another defining moment in Canadian history. Absolutely. But the trouble is when you examine it, who was actually fighting? It was British regular soldiers. It was Canadian Indian soldiers, who got really short shrift in a lot of the commemoration. So was this a founding moment in Canada? There wasn't something called Canada at that point. I mean, you know, I don't like reading back into the past things that exist much later on.
Understood. Got a minute to go. Holger Hervig, let me give it to you. Vimy, 100 years later, what does it mean to you?
What it means are the letters that I've read, hundreds of them, from average Bavarian soldiers at the front. They talk about the hell of it, the snow, the shells, the tunneling, the bombardment, the body shred, It is a memory of death, of horror. There's nothing heroic about it.
I'm really grateful to all of you for coming in tonight. In Calgary, Alberta, Holger Herwig, Professor of History Emeritus, University of Calgary, specializing in German history, and our guests here in the studio for this, I was going to say important anniversary. I can say that much, can't I? Do we have consensus on that it's an important anniversary?
That's okay.
We can debate why it's important, but it's an important anniversary, to be sure. And a reminder again, Tim Cook's latest, Vimy, The Battle and the Legend. There's this one. And The Vimy Trap, or How We Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Great War. That's Ian Mackay's latest on this. And if you do manage to get to a bookstore or something, that's how the National Post drew it up over the weekend, reprinting the front page of its newspapers from, of course, owned by a different company back then, but its newspapers 100 years ago. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating in our discussion here on TVO tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.